Hey folks, Roger here. Some time ago I made a video inviting you to tour my personal library. I made that video primarily for people who know me personally in the real world, but I was happy to see that so many of you found the video on YouTube and took time out of your day to walk with me through my library and have a discussion about world thought. I've said before that I would eventually make a recommended reading list offering suggestions from the highlight reel of world thought or books I found helpful in understanding important issues today. I mentioned that I didn't know when it would be because I'm fairly busy, and I apologize for it taking quite so long. I am busy, and this video will not be polished or perfect. I just wanted to take the time to pause and discuss these books with you. I've compiled the list, and I wanted to make it available to you. So I'll put the list, or a link to the list, which is also on my blog, in the description or in the comments. Feel free to take that list, copy and paste it onto a Word document, print it out, edit it, add things, however you choose to do it. Just think of this list as a structure to get you started. Before we begin the list or the discussion of the list, I want to make a few suggestions. First, as I mentioned before, anyone who has known me for a while knows that I have not always enjoyed reading. I'm a fairly practical person. I like to see return on my investment of time. For a long time, I did not see benefit in taking time to read. I'd rather be doing something practical, whether it's having fun or being outside or doing something I thought immediately productive. It took me a while, well into my 20s, to really see how much I can learn from books. I think that's not just me, I think that's a lot of us, right? And so what I want to suggest to you is a couple of things. Firstly, again, don't get discouraged. If you pick up a difficult book, and it is difficult, that's okay. Do your best. Don't expect to get everything from all of these books the first time. I've been reading dense material now for well over a decade, and I am still trying to master some of these books. I've been better for it, but don't be discouraged about yourself if this isn't easy to you, okay? That's fine, that's normal. Another thing I'd like to point out is that studying world thought and reading important books should not be considered a snobbish thing. I'm convinced that the founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson of the United States, their dream was to have every citizen be involved in their own governance, not ignorantly, but through considered, well-reasoned, well-read opinions, formed opinions. Thomas Jefferson gave a great deal of his library to the public so that every man could know the issues, right? So it should not be considered just a snobbish thing for rich academics or people like that to read. It should be all of us, I think. I also would like to point out that reading can be a very practical thing. Philosophy, for example, in pop culture can be seen as some abstract, not related to the real world, mental exercise by snobs in a university. It can be that, but philosophy can also be very practical. We'll talk about some books that are talking about the nature of the thing that we are as humans and what kind of life we should live, especially Christian theology. Christian theology might deal with things that seem abstract about the nature of God, but those things have implications for us in our everyday lives about how we should form our character. And we'll discuss those things. So please don't think that this is a waste of time. Please don't think that there is no practical value. I'm convinced that if all of us as citizens would take the time to study the issues a bit deeper and to understand our own cultural and ideological heritages, things would be different. The political and cultural landscape would change a bit. So these are things that I think are valuable to you. And think of this as a journey, right? When you see all these books, I don't expect that any one of my friends or my children will have read all of these books within just a couple of years or even within a lifetime. This is a journey. In reading these great books, we are retracing the steps of Western civilization. We are listening to a conversation that's been taking place for centuries, for millennia, and we are hearing the great voices from those conversations speaking to us through the written page over time. That's a fantastic thing to me. And so this is a very valuable thing to understand where we fit in to history, our cultural context. It's very helpful. It's important to back up and see what past voices have said. And the things that we take for granted today have developed over time. And these are books that will help us understand that. So the list itself is really in 3 sections. It's in a section of why the list itself is important. And in that section, I give ideas that I recommend that you consider as you read these great books. For example, what does it mean to be human? There's been an ongoing discussion about this for a long time. About morality, about the state, about what kind of government we should have, right? Because what we believe about the state, the nature of the state, will inevitably be tied to what we believe about human nature. Do we believe that human beings are social creatures, fundamentally, or private individual creatures? What we believe about justice, and therefore about law, will be affected by what we believe about, fundamentally, right and wrong, about good and evil. The fundamental questions that have been discussed for a long time now will inevitably affect the practical questions, the things that affect our day-to-day lives. And so I give in the list a sort of a rundown, a sub-list, if you will, of big ideas I suggest you consider as you read the great books. I also recommend that you keep a journal. I've kept many notebooks over the years, and I've enjoyed referring back to those things. There was a period in my life where I had severe doubts about the Christian faith. I am a Christian, but I went through a period, even in the ministry, of questioning whether or not the things I held to were true. And so I wrote all my questions down. How do I know Jesus existed, for example? And I would take notes in a notebook as I sought and I read and I got answers to those questions. I would take notes of what other thinkers thought. I would compare those thinkers amongst themselves, and I took notes on those things. Those things have been helpful, and I suggest that you do that too with whichever topic you choose to study. So once you get through the list of considering those big ideas that are discussed in the great books, the list itself is then broken down into 2 further sections. The second section is a chronological-ish list of the great books from Western civilization. Begins at the beginning with the ancient Greeks and runs through the Roman period into the medieval period, into the Renaissance Reformation era, into the modern and postmodern era. And those books are semi-chronological. They're not organized topically. And so you'll find a book on moral philosophy right behind a book on, applied science. So those are books that are important. They're considered great books because they've had some impact on Western civilization or world thought. They don't just imply that they took a work of genius to write, but that they've had some influence. Past that, you'll find a third section on a topical list. So once you have a basic understanding of the development of world thought, that topical list consists of books I've found helpful in understanding contemporary important issues. There's a topical section on Christian apologetics. These are books that I've found helpful at a layman's level to understanding why Christians believe what they believe and whether or not Christianity makes sense. And then I go a little bit further and say, if you want something a little bit more scholarly, here are some more developed, a little bit tougher, more dense works. These are books I've found helpful on, say, the manuscript data behind the New Testament, or the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And so those are books that I find topically helpful. There's also sections on the abortion debate, on feminism, on postmodernism, on Islam in the West, some key issues about different ways of viewing America's role in the world. And these aren't books, keep this in mind please as well. I'm not suggesting that you read these books because I agree with all of them. I certainly don't. These are books that I found helpful to understand the issues on the topical section. Whether you're consider yourself politically left or politically right or libertarian, there are books on the list that are, discuss different views of Americans' role in the world abroad. For example, Henry Kissinger's on there, Hillary Clinton's on there. So different views are presented, and I hope that's helpful to you. I think if you read those topical books from that section, you will have come away with a fairly comprehensive, better formed view of that topic than you would have otherwise, I think. So what I recommend is that you start at the beginning at the topical list, and you just pick one or two. I don't expect of yourself to read them all. Pick one or two and begin reading through the chronological list. Maybe pick something from Aristotle and read something from Aristotle. But also, so that you don't get bogged down in stuff you're not super interested in, pick some topic from the topical list and get a couple books from those and read through those carefully. The books in the topical section, a section about more contemporary issues, do depend upon the older thinkers to understand the conversation, the broader conversation. But I think it would be helpful to read one or two from the chronological History of Western Civ great book list, and also pick something from the topical list. So I hope this list is helpful to you. I cannot discuss all of these books in detail, or we would be here literally for many hours. So what I'd like to do is just share some highlights with you. I'll mention several of these books, and then I will discuss how some of them are important. And I'm going to try to not offer too much of my own opinion. I will offer some, but these are some suggestions that I have for you to form your own opinions. And so what I would recommend, of course, is that you look at the hard copy list. It's going to be much longer than what we discuss here. All right, so a very good book to start off with is a book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. You might find it a humorous title. How in the world could I read a book if I don't know how to read a book? Well, Mortimer Adler actually discusses I think the real problem that we have a literate society, but we don't have a highly literate society or a deeply literate society. Many of us learn to read at the elementary level, and then we stop there, right? So we can pronounce words on a page, but we really cannot handle difficult texts. And even if you look at literature over time, literature is sort of shallowing out. That's because we are so busy, we read on the surface. Maybe we read wide, but we don't read very deep. Mortimer Adler discusses that, and he talks about how to improve your own reading habits. And so he talks about different levels of reading. He begins with the elementary level, and he discusses an inspectional level. He discusses deeper levels. He actually offers insight on how to take notes, how to understand and break down different types of text, whether it's news or whether it's philosophy or theology. He discusses how to read those different types of things. And he talks about something I think is very important, and this is where I really think this book is worth a start, worth a read. He talks about synoptical reading, and that is trying to understand what an author says about an important topic, let's say Nietzsche. And you understand what Nietzsche says about morality. But then you think synoptically, because Nietzsche is a voice in a conversation about morality. You think synoptically, meaning what does Nietzsche think in comparison to Aristotle? What does Nietzsche think? What would Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and Nietzsche say in dialogue with one another? And you can think synoptically, meaning you've read a little bit deeper than the elementary level. You don't just know the words on the page, but you've broken down and digested the ideas, and now you're comparing those ideas of this thinker with the ideas of other thinkers. And that is extremely important, and I think that's something that most of us don't learn in schools. It's a skill that you have to learn. It's an acquired thing. I've not yet mastered it myself, but it's something that I think would be helpful. I would actually, in my opinion, high schoolers should read this book. All college students should read this book. or at least get the skills from the book. These are really necessary skills. So this is a book, How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, is a great one to start off with. Before the chronological section, I kind of give you a subset, a cheat list, if you will. And these are summary books that if you don't have time to read all of the books, you just kind of want the digested, I want the gist of it. These are books that'll help you. Or they might serve as guides as you read through the chronological list, right? So for history, I actually recommend an author named Susan Wise Bauer. She lives here in Virginia. She's a college professor, and she's written 3 volumes as of yet. This is the history of the medieval world. She has a history of the ancient world and a history of the, I think she calls it the Renaissance world. I believe, don't quote me, but I think she's working on a history of the modern world. I'm actually looking forward to that. That would be the American period, the World Wars, modern Europe, etc. But a benefit to what she does is it is sort of Western-centric, but as she discusses what might be happening in, say, Greece, she also bounces over to say, at this time, contemporary to this event in Greece, this is what the Egyptians are doing, this is what the Persians are doing, this is what the... And so you sort of get a more full, comprehensive view of history. My memory is not the best. I'm not great with names and dates, but this is a great survey that has helped me sort of freshen my memory on important historical events. So I'd recommend these volumes by Susan Wise Bauer for a historical survey. Another important topic, speaking of history, this is a book that I think in pop culture, the history of the Crusades is something that is vastly misunderstood. So this is a great book, A Concise History of the Crusades. I think even Wikipedia references this. Not that that gives it very good credentials, but A Concise History of the Crusades by Thomas F. Madden is a great source, a short, concise view of the Crusades, about why they started, about various things that took place. This is a great one, I think, just to kind of skim through at least. A History of Philosophy. So a man named Frederick Copleston wrote a philosophical survey, if you will. And he went through the history of Western ideas, Western thought, and he begins with the ancient Greeks, goes through the Romans, and he shows you these ideas developing, and he kind of puts them in a sort of a dialogue. This is what Schopenhauer said about so-and-so. And these books are excellent. Frederick Copleston was a Roman Catholic philosopher. He debated Bertrand Russell back in the 40s. It was a great debate. You can listen to it on YouTube. It was a big deal back then. But I think his Roman Catholicism does not dictate. He's not overly biased. This is a great survey of Western thought. And you can get these volumes from Barnes & Noble for about $14 or $15 new. Or you can be like me, and if you don't have a lot of money, you save it by going to thriftbooks.com and getting these for about $3, I think, or so a piece with free shipping. Now, I don't get any kickback from thrift books. That's just a tool a friend recommended to me, and I have saved hundreds and hundreds of dollars by finding my books. If you can do with them used or an older edition, man, save yourself some money. But these are great. This particular volume is on from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche, but he just covers so much territory. These are great, especially if you don't want to read everything that Schopenhauer wrote. Pick you up a few of these. Any volume is helpful. The Beginnings of Western Science. David Lindbergh, I believe, wrote that one. And that's a book that discusses the ideas that in pop culture and popular science we often forget that really gave rise to the scientific revolution. There is an idea in culture that the Enlightenment is really the beginning of Western science. There was really no scientific advancement until the Enlightenment. That's been largely shown to be almost mythological. Obviously, we have the Industrial Revolution. We have extreme scientific progress. But scientific progress reaches much further back into history than just the 1700s. And there are also ideas that gave rise to the scientific revolution. And so David Lindbergh, in a book called The Beginnings of Western Science, really discusses some important things there. It gives us some perspective on scientific heritage. I think Susan Wise Bauer wrote a good one on that as well. If you'd like to know something about Christian theology, This is a professor I respect a great deal. He helped me, not personally, but through reading his books. Professor Alistair McGrath out of Oxford University. This is a fantastic survey of Christian theology as it relates to, as it's developed over time, as it has related to world culture and world ideas, world thought. If you don't have time to read, if you see on my bookshelf behind me, I have a very large section of Christian writings from the first few hundred years of Christian history. If you don't have time to read that, none of us do, this is a great one. I highly recommend this to you. It's worth the investment of time and money into getting this book. Even if you're not a Christian, understanding Christianity is really crucial to understanding something about the development of Western civilization. There's just no getting around it. So this is a great book on that. Another book by Dr. McGrath is a book called Christianity's Dangerous Idea. This is the Protestant Revolution, a history from the 16th century to the 21st. And Dr. McGrath really talks about the Reformation, Martin Luther's grievances with the Catholic Church. And really, Martin Luther had he was a catalyst in thought in the West because he obviously had his grievances, his thesis, his 95 theses, in which he disagreed with the Catholic Church. But really, he disagreed about really the interpretation of the doctrine of justification. How was a man justified before God? How are human beings justified in the sight of God? And he offered a different interpretation. It has something to do with grace, and it has something to do with an interpretation of Romans that the Reformers really brought up. That effect trickled out through Western Civ, not just in theological circles, not just in churches, but also in the way we view government, believe it or not. And this book really discusses that. The idea of authority. See, the 1500s were a very crucial time in the West. It's a time of great change. The Henry VIII was challenging sort of the political and dogmatic authority of the Roman Catholic Church, for good or for bad. Philosophers were doing the same. René Descartes, we'll discuss him. A lot of change in thought was taking place in the 1500s, 1600s. Modern philosophy with Descartes began. Political change was taking place. And Martin Luther had something that was really a dangerous idea. So this is a book worth checking out for sure. There is a book, if you'd like to understand fundamentalism in the United States. George Marsden wrote a book called Fundamentalism in American Culture, in which it's sort of a dry history text, but he does sort of trace the beginnings of fundamentalism. Christian fundamentalism was a reaction against modernism and theological liberalism. The idea that miracles don't really take place, that we have no scientific grounds for believing in the miraculous. If that's the case, then perhaps Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead. Perhaps the idea of the Trinity is just sort of a metaphysical, philosophical mumbo-jumbo. If that's the case, how do we hold on to Christianity while also modernizing, fitting it into modernity? Well, theological liberalism was affected by those modern, considered liberal ideas. Fundamentalism was originally a reaction against that. And initially you had great academics, people in high universities who had multiple earned PhDs, reacting against modernism and theological liberalism. But the ideas that they had of separating from the universities, separating from culture, fundamentalism today is not the same as it was back when it initially started. Because the terms they took back then have carried on. They went further and further in that direction, just as theological liberalism has in the other direction. So that is something worth knowing something about. Fundamentalism in American Culture by Marsden. So if you want a summary of mythology, I would recommend Thomas Bulfinch's book called Bulfinch's Mythology. I'm not an expert in mythology. It's something that I find very interesting. The stories are fairly epic, literally sometimes. Some great themes that we have in mind today are still present there. Some of the same stories we tell today might be rehashed older stories, right? But my memory is not the best for such detail. I think partly because I'm just so busy in the modern world, right? But a great summary of mythology is this book. So Bullfinch was a man, I think, who lived in Victorian England, and he took the great stories that he thought were worth passing along from Norse mythology and Greek mythology and various pagan stories, and also, I think, romantic French stories and such. And he cleaned them up a bit, and he gave the sort of proper British, more family-friendly version. But these are great summaries of a lot of great stories from history. So this is a great. I think I got this for $10 or $15 from Barnes and Noble. So this is worth having for sure. A great book on logic. So logic can be something that is more formal. It can be, modern computer logic is actually derived from older forms of logic from really Socratic, Aristotelian logic. Logic gates in computers and such is actually derived from logical rules from the past. I believe it was Alfred Whitehead and Bertrand Russell developed symbolic logic that is behind a lot of mathematics today. But behind all of that, and behind really any reasonable thought, are the laws of logic. Well, this is a textbook I found helpful. It's short, it's easy to get into, it's easy to digest. I am not a logician formally at all, but this is a great book, worth your time to consider about the laws of logic and how to think reasonably about situations. Socratic Logic, a logic text using the Socratic method, Platonic questions and Aristotelian principles by Peter Kreeft. This book shouldn't be too expensive, but this is a great introductory book to logic. There are others out there. Some of you might suggest some in the comments, but that is certainly one worth getting into. Another summary book I would recommend about culture and the history of ideas is Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a professor. He studied, I believe, medieval lit, but he was a professor at, I believe he taught at Oxford and Cambridge at certain points in his life. Discarded Image was a book in which he discusses the medieval worldview, the view that the medieval Western world had of the cosmos, of how the planets worked, of how basic logic worked, of their view of state. So the medievals tended to think of the world in a hierarchy, and that's represented in, say, Dante, of how the spheres of the cosmos worked, in my view, of how society was structured in sort of a hierarchy, right? Well, much of the thinking of the medievals was what they were trying to do was synthesize a sort of comprehensive worldview based on learned truths. And so they took Aristotelian principles that were, some of them I think are true, but were very long considered to be true. And they blended them with Christian ideas, and they sort of had this synthetic worldview based on Athens and Jerusalem. But they also borrowed from wherever else they could get knowledge. The problem was they weren't always so critical about it, but they might get knowledge from other sources as well. But not all of that was true, and they created a beautiful world picture. And I think C.S. Lewis says in the end of the book that the problem was that it just wasn't all the way true. So that is a discarded image of the world. It's a short book, but very, very well worth your time to understand some development in Western thought. Another good book worth reading is a man named Ed Feser. He's a former atheist. I believe he's a Roman Catholic now, but he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Mind, a beginner's guide. And it is a book that introduces different views of how the mind works. Of, is there a soul behind it all? Are we two parts? Are we body and soul? Is there a blending of body and soul? Or are we just that one thing? Are we the two things? Or is the soul nothing more than an imagined thing? Are we just material automatons? Different views of the mind, the human mind, how it works. He discusses, I think fairly, I don't think he is biased towards his view in the book, but he presents different views fairly, and that's a great introduction. It's not very long, and it's written in, layman's introductory, easy to grasp terms. Philosophy of Mind by Ed Feser. So after that section of cheat books or guidebooks or summary books, the list itself chronologically begins. So after that section of cheat books or summary guidebooks, the list itself begins in chronological order. I will not discuss all of these here. Again, we'd be here for hours discussing each of these books, or even just reading the books, the titles of the books, and discussing why they're important. So I would recommend that you get the list and look at it for yourself. It begins with the ancient Greeks, and I will mention some of these books and perhaps discuss why some of them are important and fit in with other books. But the discussion does begin with the ancient Greeks, Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. That book, I think, will always be relevant, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Odyssey is one book, one of 4 books that I keep by my bed. It's worth reading and coming back to again. It might mean different things to different people in different generations, but it's certainly worth a read, if nothing else because it's such a great world epic. It's had so much influence. Well, let me say this. The Odyssey is important for one reason because after the Trojan War, the events that took place after the Trojan War, the Odyssey back home, those themes were picked up by later authors, the Romans, with the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid. So the Romans, somewhat looked down upon the Greeks, and they tend to glorify the Trojans, right? Well, when they're talking about their own book about Roman identity and national identity, their own mythos, they pick up the theme of the descendants of Troy. And so those people who fled the city, who survived, looking for a new place to start a city. And of course, lo and behold, they found their way to what would become Rome. And so Virgil writes upon the eve of a great Roman emperor, and he's talking about national identity, and he actually writes about this golden age that would come about upon this sort of messianic figure. Christians read the book later and thought that he was really talking about, in his own way, about Jesus. It was some sort of prophetic writing about the coming of Christ. Of course, it was also possible he was talking about the Roman emperor. But the themes of the Odyssey are picked up by the Romans and by later thinkers, even in the modern period in Ireland. So the Odyssey is certainly worth knowing something about. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a great read. Captain Picard on Star Trek The Next Generation gives a great summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But that book does discuss some themes about humanity's relationship to nature, about what sets man apart from the animals. Those themes are sort of lightly in there, but it's a great book. It's old like the book of Job from the Bible. Know something about Plato, certainly. Know something about what Plato thought about ideals, about Platonic ideals, his theory of the cave, his theory of forms. Certainly know something about that. If you don't want to read all of the books written by Plato, then certainly look it up on Wikipedia or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the internet. It's a great resource. I list several books here by Plato. Look at the list for yourself if you'd like to read them all. But certainly read The Republic. I would also recommend Crito, his Apology, and the Laws, and the Timaeus. The Timaeus is a great one as well. Aristotle, several books here by Aristotle as well. I would suggest that his book on physics is a little dated, and is probably not a priority for you. But his books on metaphysics, the book on metaphysics plays a big role in later thinking about really the cosmos, how logic works, how even theology is influenced by Aristotle's metaphysics, even Christian theology. His book on ethics is important. His book on politics is a must-read and probably a reread. His book on poetics, on the art. So there's different philosophy about what art is and how it works. So for the longest time in Western civilization, the goal of art was thought to be in some way beauty. Art from the ancient Greeks through the Romans and into the Christian European period, art was to reflect beauty, which is considered to be a real thing, and to get the observer in contact in some way with a transcendent reality. Modernism had a great deal of change. That's no longer the case in the modern, postmodern era. When you go to Washington, D.C., and you look on the National Mall, and you see the art museum, and you can walk through Western history through the form of painting and statues, right? The art you see reflects the ideas of the time. So if you see Enlightenment era paintings, you might see wealthy French aristocrats who could afford family portraits hanging on the wall, which I find humorous that I'm a poor American person and I can go in there and see the paintings from this wealthy aristocratic family for free. If you're in the medieval era, you might see all sorts of different portrayals of Madonna and Child, of Christian ideas, of biblical stories, of what they thought the angelic pantheon was. The ideas that were considered important at the time are reflected in the art. But behind all of that is this understanding that beauty is a real thing, that transcendent realities are in fact real. And then when you go to the Modern Art Museum, you can see that major shifts in thinking have taken place, and that's a whole video and discussion in itself. There is a great book on art that I've not finished reading myself. It's a survey of art. Perhaps I'll share that another time. But all of that begins with really, I would recommend Aristotle's book on poetics. Then in the list, we cover several plays: Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. I believe even Freud mentions Oedipus Rex. So these plays are worth knowing something about. Agamemnon, of course, the Greek king. Several books here I'll skip over. I will suggest to you, not because I'm a Christian, but because of its value in world thought, read the Old Testament, what Jews would call the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament. Definitely take some time to read through at least the book of Genesis, but have an understanding of the way the different sections in that book, it's a library really, it's not just a book. And so you have different sections. You have poetry, the Song of Solomon, the Psalms, you have prophecy, you have a history of the Jewish people in the ancient world. But really a very important thing about the book of Genesis is that the Jewish and the Christian picture of human nature, of God, and the world begins in Genesis. There are different interpretations of Genesis, but regardless of how you interpret, the literary, whether the days are literally 24 hours or not, wherever you stand, the beginnings of the picture that Christians and Jews would paint about human nature, about God and the world, begin in Genesis. So whether or not you are a Christian, you would do well to understand something about that. So I do recommend to you that you read through the Old Testament, especially Genesis. The Hippocrates, Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. Now I have an edition here of Thucydides, an ancient historian who writes about the Peloponnesian War, Greek events, right? This is the best edition I found. This is called the Landmark Thucydides. And this is an edition that I think the Commandant of the Marine Corps has put and required Marine Corps officers to read. This book is the work. It's a good translation of Thucydides, but it's also annotated, gives you explanations of geography, events, reasons behind the fighting, etc. And I would suggest that any man would do well to take some time to read through this. This was the World War of the time. This is a major event, and this particular edition is worth having. You could probably find it on thrift books. There's also a landmark Herodotus, the Greek historian, but certainly know something about the Peloponnesian War and good old Thucydides. I'm going to skip some of these, but you have Euclid, the Elements, Lucretius on the nature of things. Lucretius was a materialist, in a sense an atheist poet, and he had a materialist view of the universe, and he writes a great epic poem on the nature of things, certainly worth considering. Julius Caesar, The Conquest of Gaul, Cicero, The Republic, The founding fathers of the United States would have taken into consideration many of the ancient works about what a democracy would be or what a republic would be. And Cicero also had a discussion on natural law that was not unnoticed by natural theorists of the Enlightenment period that would have affected the United States. So know something about Cicero, Virgil, the Aeneid, a great epic. It's difficult. May I suggest that when you consider the Aeneid, don't expect to know every reference there. The Aeneid is a difficult work. It's very political. Virgil's making comments on people who were alive at the time, whether or not they would be here or there, if I understand it correctly. But that is a book, again, about Roman national identity. It's sort of the cultural backdrop, the mythos of Rome. I recommend also that you read the New Testament. Consider really, whether you're a Christian or an atheist, a Muslim, consider the words, the teachings of Jesus. I do recommend that to you to consider for your own life, but also consider the ideas, because those ideas are extremely influential in world thought. The events that took place around the first century in Palestine changed the world. It was a slow revolution that came in waves. The discussions of human nature, about the nature of God, about life and death. If you consider Homer's view of the afterlife, the Greek view, the Jewish view before Christ, there was a revolution in thought about the afterlife resultant from what people believed about Jesus of Nazareth. All kinds of things. So consider the words of Jesus, and I would also recommend reading, say, the book of Romans from the New Testament. But as a Christian, I'd say it's all gold, so I'd recommend you read it. Tacitus is a Roman historian. You can get him fairly cheaply or probably free on the internet. Tacitus, the Annals, the Histories. Ptolemy, it's a dense work. Know something about it, but don't invest too much time in it. If you look at the book, you will know quickly that he was a smart man. He wasn't as foolish as modern thinkers might think he was. Plutarch wrote works that are called the lives of the noble Greeks and the Romans. So you could pick certain characters from history, lives of great men, Alexander or Caesar, and just read a couple of those from Plutarch. He's a good historical source. St. Augustine, or Augustine, he wrote several books, of course, but he did influence world thought and certain views of the state. So know something about the city of God and his Confessions, which is a pretty rich doctrinal discussion from his own point of view. Bede, the ecclesiastical history of the British people. Bede was really recording early events in the formation of England as a country post-Rome. Very important book to sort of survey, at least know something about. Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, I believe it was before AD 50. Some YouTube scholars should correct me on that. But Marcus Aurelius, of course, was a Roman emperor, but he was also a Stoic philosopher. This is one of the 4 books I keep by my bed. So, Stoicism and Christianity disagree at points. Where they disagree, I go with Christianity. But Stoicism as a philosophy is, I think, something that should be considered today because it serves as a corrective to, I think, modern American culture. What do I mean by that? I'm an American. I'm very proud of my country in many ways. But to say this politely, we have an attitude of consumerism based on the idea of feeding the appetite. It's not all bad, but it can sometimes be overdone. We can place happiness in getting things, in feeding the appetite, and pleasure. Joy, in my view, does not come from pleasure or feeding the appetite. That is something we're sold in commercials. And I'm all about American business and companies, but I think at some point, consumerism, hedonism, materialism can be unhealthy. So I'd like to say this politely in a non-crude way, but a good thing can be warped into something that is no longer good. Natural desires for food, for sex, can be warped into things that are no longer good for us. And we can have an unhealthy view of life. Self-restraint is something that Stoicism teaches. So Marcus Aurelius, though he's a Stoic philosopher, these are his meditations, his considerations of his own life. I do not agree with him on certain points, but the general idea of having self-restraint and self-discipline is something that I think is very needed for everyone, especially for someone considering how to be a man in today's culture. These are things that should be revisited. General Mattis, a very respected United States Marine general, this is a book that he sort of has carried around with him, he said. This is a book that has been formative in his thinking. And so I would recommend that you think about it, certainly. To be honest with you, I found that I'm rather inconsistent. I found that in certain areas of my life, I'm able to show I've trained myself to have restraint, to not be caught up in the passion of the moment, in desire or passion or anger dictated by my circumstances. In some ways, this book has helped me, along with the New Testament book of 1 John, and having, I think, a better attitude towards certain events and appetites. I'm not consistent in every aspect of my life and in those things I'm working on, but not just for its contribution to world thought, but just for personal development. I do recommend considering Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Asser, he wrote about King Alfred the Great. Now, this book, of course, is in the aftermath of Rome got all the way to Britannia and was conquering an impressive amount of geography. When Rome left, they left a giant vacuum. So the people who lived in Britain and England, there was a lot going on there in the absence of the Romans. So Asser records the events of really a great king, King Alfred the Great. And this is a man who, in the ashes of a great civilization, built a new one, and that is worth something. That's worth knowing something about. If you'd like a great story, read Beowulf. Tolkien, believe it or not, has a great translation of Beowulf. I've got a fancy green hardback cover. In the back of the book, he offers his translation notes, and I think perhaps maybe lecture notes, but he offers a discussion about Beowulf as a story. Was it a pagan story? Was it a Christian story? Was it both? Some great discussion to be had there. Tolkien himself takes up the discussion in his own translation. Read Beowulf. St. Thomas Aquinas from the 1200s. Aquinas was very influential in Roman Catholic theology, but he was also very influential as a philosopher. He's influenced many other thinkers. He wrote about natural law. He took Aristotelian models of sort of logic in the cosmos and used those, which were the established academic order after Platonism in the West. And he sort of took those with Christian theology. And some things perhaps I wouldn't agree with, but I know they're very influential, say on the Catholic teachings of, I think on the Eucharist, things like this. But he's very influential in the view of the state, and on human nature. His discussion of natural law was very important, and you'll find it still present, though not the same, in later Enlightenment thinkers. Again, this idea of natural law reaches deep into the Western tradition, to Cicero, the Roman emperor, to Thomas Aquinas, and John Locke and those Enlightenment thinkers who influenced the United States and modern Europe. And these ideas of rights, natural rights, right? Those ideas reach far back into the West. Of course, they did not agree with Aquinas on a lot of things. It's not the same type of a system, but they are connected. So know something about Aquinas. Also, Thomas Aquinas did offer, I think, a worthwhile discussion about the existence of God. He has something called the 5 ways. And these are essentially 5 syllogisms or logical arguments discussing whether or not the existence of God in the traditional Christian theist sense makes sense based on the nature of the world. And Thomas Aquinas, I think, gives some very good discussion about whether or not the existence of God is resonant with the world we live in. He has an argument from change, from motion, etc. Ed Feser does a great book on this. It's in the apologetics topical list, but Ed Feser has a book called Thomas Aquinas and a Beginner Guide. Because Aquinas wrote in a different time. He was a mind, I think, sort of like Einstein. He was a little bit difficult to follow. Especially even translated into English, he was so far removed culturally from us that some commentary on what he's saying is helpful. So I found Ed Feser's book to be very helpful. But I would recommend knowing something about Thomas Aquinas, his view of the 5 ways, his ideas of natural law, etc. Dante's Divine Comedy, certainly worth reading. Man, the Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, and Dante's Divine Comedy, certainly worth knowing something about. Again, I think a very political book, perhaps more so than Virgil almost, and some ideas about some common cultural assumptions about the afterlife, for example, are really taken from Dante, perhaps more than the scriptures. But he's worth knowing something about. If anything, it's an entertaining read. It's difficult at times, but very worthwhile. Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. So when Latin was still an influential language, English was sort of new on the scene. Chaucer was one of the first, or perhaps the first, great English work. It is tough to read. The Canterbury Tales are broken up by different stories of the Knight's Tale, etc. But know something about that. Thomas More's Utopia, 1500s. Thomas More knew, of course, Henry VIII. So in a time when the views of the state, of political authority were changing, Thomas More, a Roman Catholic minister, was an early humanist. Today we associate humanism with secular humanism, but of course humanism actually got its start really in the West with religious thinkers. Thomas More being one of those, and in this book he imagines I believe it's an island, a land where he discovers, so to speak, that he thinks is just this perfect, great society in many ways, and that's his utopia. Of course, I would not agree with Mr. Thomas More on a lot of this, but it is worth knowing something about. Erasmus, an important scholar, he wrote a book called In Praise of Folly. He was also instrumental in creating a text behind which English translations of the Bible were formed. Martin Luther, his 95 Thesis, again, we've discussed him. Know something about Luther. Machiavelli, The Prince. Machiavelli is a book I'm sure you know about if you haven't read it, because it's all over pop culture. We even use the term Machiavellian still. Well, Machiavelli was a sort of a break, because this is a crude summary, but essentially Machiavelli said that we should not depend upon fate. Perhaps you are fated to be a king, and I am fated to be a pauper. This is my place in life that the gods or God has determined, and I am fated to play out my role, right? Machiavelli took a more, for lack of a better word, scientific view that we should make observations, make predictions, make plans, and then make it happen. We will ourselves into power. Of course, he said some rather cruel things, but this is a book that was sort of represents a break, I think, in some political thinking. John Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion, you can find a summarized, abridged version of that. Montaigne, he writes several articles. I would recommend looking him up on Wikipedia at least. Stephen Hawking. So I've recommended this before, but Stephen Hawking compiled a book. He didn't write it, but he compiled this book on physics. These are great works from physics. You have Copernicus, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, and Einstein. And he took their books. These are all very readable in our language. the math is a little bit tough here and there, right? But these are books that have been influential in thinking about physics or science. So you don't be hard on yourself if you don't understand everything they write about, but know something about them. Know something about why the Copernican revolution was a big deal, about Galileo, about Einstein's relativity. I mean, Einstein's relativity might seem like an abstract thing, but real technology takes that theory into account. GPS technology depends upon Einstein's relativity, for example. And some of the things that you can use as far as certain physical models, of course, we can use for making certain predictions. Other physical models we have to use for other predictions, for other instances. And these are books that are influential there. Another thing to consider is exactly why the medievals at first bucked against the Copernican revolution, right? Perhaps there were some religious reasons there. Some would see older ideas as being taught in the scriptures. But there was also that Aristotelian sort of Ptolemaic model of the cosmos that was accepted in academia and was being challenged, they thought, haphazardly. So it was religious, but there was also academic pushback. And those things are good to know about. And at the time, there was sort of a blending between religious and academic authority in some regards. But know something about this book. This is a nice volume that contains them all. So I'd highly recommend you get this one. Sure, so Sir Isaac Newton's Principia, Kepler's Harmony of the World, Galileo Galilei, dialogues concerning the new sciences, Copernicus on the revolution of heavenly spheres are all contained in that volume. Know something about Francis Bacon. Some consider him to be the father of modern science. William Shakespeare. So I have just now, at this stage in my life, within the last couple of years, begun to see the value in literature and play. I told you I think I'm sort of a practical person, so I don't see much value in spending my limited time reading fiction. That started to change. Some fiction has value. For example, Macbeth, Shakespeare takes great and important themes and he uses imagery to convey these ideas. Philosophers discuss these great ideas, these great themes of human nature, of morality, of God. But poets can do it too, and this is something that's a bit of a new idea to me in the last couple of years. But in Macbeth, Shakespeare discusses the theme of fate, which was really the word W-Y-R-D. Are we fated to play the role that we live? Is it my fate? Am I simply condemned to my lot in life? Do I even have a choice in that? Do I have free will? Is life a tale told by an idiot, full of all this noise, but when it's over, it's nothing? If I'm an evil man, like Macbeth, do I really have a choice in the matter? Is this my choice, or am I damned to be this way? These are great themes in the story of Macbeth. Shakespeare wrote many others. I have not read them all. I certainly don't understand them all fully, but I would highly recommend you know something about Macbeth and know something about Shakespeare. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, sort of the Bible of the free market model. The idea that the unseen hand comes from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. There's a lot could be said there. We'll just have to keep moving. Thomas Jefferson, Notes on the State of Virginia, Statute of Religious Liberty. If you're an American, stop what you're doing. Read Thomas Jefferson's Note on the States of Virginia and Statute of Religious Liberty. There's also a book that I got. It's the letters of Jefferson and John Adams. They were friends for many years. They had a falling out, but they wrote into their old age. You can see what they thought privately as opposed to what they wrote publicly. They changed as they got older, as they aged. Both of them. John Adams, I think, rejected the idea of the Trinity. Jefferson, as he got older, he got more and more vocal about it, but he thought the idea of the Trinity was a metaphysical sophistry left over from the Catholic Middle Ages, right? It's interesting to see what they say privately, and you kind of see some of their character there. That's a book worth reading as well. Thomas Paine, when the academics and the folks in charge were discussing whether or not we should go to war with Great Britain for independence, Thomas Paine was writing pamphlets, getting the everyman, the farmer, the worker, riled up and ready to go. Common sense and the rights of man. The older I get, the more I think I disagree with Paine on some things, but he's entertaining and he's worth knowing something about historically. The Declaration of Independence. I recommend to you to read the Declaration of Independence as an adult. Take a night, turn off everything else, think carefully through the Declaration of Independence. There is a lot of things we could say about that. People smarter than myself have said a lot of things about that, but read it as an adult for yourself. The Federalist Papers by James Madison and John Jay. Why is that valuable? If you want to understand, and I think this is very important, the Founding Fathers' original intent, there was a discussion about the type of government we should have. Madison, whose home you can still visit, it's a beautiful place, he offered opinions with John Jay in what are called the Federalist Papers. There's many of them, and they discuss many important issues. In contrast to that, there was something called the Anti-Federalist Papers, with those who did not want the federal government to have as much power as it does, or did. There was a dialogue, a very tense debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, as you probably know. But know something about that. There are two basic models for when we're trying to understand the United States Constitution. We could take an originalist perspective, sort of a hermeneutic or method of interpreting the document, in which we try to see what the Founding Fathers originally thought and their intent behind writing the words in the document. John Jay and Madison's Federalist Papers has a lot to say there. Of course, there is another model in which we consider the Constitution to be a living document, they say, in which it's the intent of the founders who wrote the document is not as important as the modern sort of pragmatic needs of modern populace. So the interpretation of the document can be rather fluid. That's another discussion to be had, but either way, Madison's The Federalist Papers is important to understanding the original intent. I do recommend, if you're an American, you definitely read that. Immanuel Kant, a great moral philosopher from the modern period, the Enlightenment period. Critique of Pure Reason. He wrote an essay you can get on the internet called What is Enlightenment? His Metaphysics of Morals, Critique of Pure Reason, etc. Know something about Kant. The Constitution of the United States. Read it as an adult. Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. So, after the United States separated, declared independence, fought a war with Great Britain, again, a lot of world change was taking place, the French Revolution. Edmund Burke, from across the pond, supported the American Revolution because he thought that, essentially, American colonists' rights as Englishmen were in fact being trampled upon, and the Americans needed to do what they did, essentially. He rejected the idea of the French Revolution because he thought that it was different. The French Revolution, to Burke, was something that was very quickly and without a great deal of thought eroding and erasing the culture and institutions of a great country, and propping up in its place something far inferior and dangerous. In fact, the revolution in France did lead to violence. Why Burke's work is important today is because he discusses very important ideas for conservatism in the West. Are there cultural institutions, traditions, values, heritage that has been passed along to us that are worth holding on to and being very careful about doing away with? Burke is a good person to listen to on that. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Mary Wollstonecraft, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. This is a sort of a early feminist work. This is really pre-feminist, but I would highly recommend reading Mary Wollstonecraft's book. Whether or not you would agree with it, this is a discussion, at least to her, about taking the ideas behind the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, those ideas, and the rights that are entailed in that, and in her mind, extending that to women as well in ways they hadn't been perhaps in the past. She saw what she thought was unfair treatment of women, and she calls it out. Whether you agree or not, it's certainly worth a read. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was a romantic poet, so after the Enlightenment, you have a sort of reaction against the Enlightenment and the Romanticists, the Romantics. So he wrote a book called Biographia Literaria, and all that is his theory of how literature works. It's a bit clumsy, but it's fairly important. But he wrote some good poems as well. Charles Lyell, Principles of Geology. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, Volume 2. So again, Tocqueville was a French aristocrat who toured the United States, and he did it on business, but he also wanted to see why American democracy was working in ways that other democracies perhaps did not. And his outsider's view of the United States is highly worth some time. And he was concerned, of course, that this democracy, like others, could fail and perhaps eventually would. It's worth considering. Hegel, Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist, I think, is a discussion of industrialism gone wrong, unchecked, if you will. Julius Caesar, I'm back at Shakespeare. Antony and Cleopatra. Backing back up here, Rene Descartes, Meditations on First Philosophy, Discourse on Method. Descartes is considered by many to be the sort of the founder of modern philosophy. There's a lot that could be said there. Thomas Hobbes, Milton's Areopagitica. Everyone knows about Paradise Lost. Look up Areopagitica. It's a throwback to an older speech, but in the Areopagitica, Milton is discussing key ideas about freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, censorship. That's a very, very relevant thing today with the debates about freedom of speech, the limits of it. Milton doesn't answer all the questions, but it is a sort of foundational text. So that's something about the Areopagitica. Of course, Paradise Lost. There's many works here. I'm going to start skipping over some. Pilgrim's Progress is a good read. John Locke's second treatise of civil government is mandatory for understanding the United States, for understanding the Declaration of Independence. Again, this is a discussion of natural law. This thinking has been largely rejected by the modern world. John Rawls, a more modern thinker, is something that's offered up in its stead. But initially, the founders were working off of, to a large extent, the ideas of natural law. Know something about natural law and social contract theory. John Locke. Also, his letter concerning toleration. In a time when religious toleration wasn't quite where we wanted it to be yet, he wrote a worthwhile thing there. Here are some scientific works here. A treatise on light. We're going to start skipping. Montesquieu, The Spirit of the Laws, an important book. Rousseau is a sort of Enlightenment type of a thinker. The Social Contract. Jumping back to Dickens with a Christmas Carol, just worth a read. Kierkegaard wrote a book called Fear and Trembling, but he was an early existentialist. He was a Christian, and again, today when we think of existentialism, we think primarily of perhaps Sartre. Well, existentialism, long before Sartre, was with Kierkegaard, a Christian theologian. Whether you agree with him or not, he was influential. Frederick Douglass, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. That's a book, as Good Will Hunting says, that'll blow your hair back. Take a couple evenings and read that book. It's good to know something about Manifesto of the Communist Party by Marx and Engels. Marxism is something that you should know. Marxism is a competitor to other worldviews. Marxism isn't just an economic model. This is a competing narrative. It's a competitor with Christianity for what it means to be human and all the things that are entailed in that. Know something about Marxism. Moby Dick, Herman Melville. Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species, very influential book. John Stuart Mill, I'd recommend reading his book on liberty. There's another work he did, The Considerations of Representative Government. But the book on liberty has discussion on freedom of thought and freedom of speech. Mill thought he knew the answer for what the limits of free speech were. And that is something that is entirely relevant today. And of course, utilitarianism. He also wrote something on the subjection of women. Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov, that is something I do not fully understand. I sort of have started it and not read it all thoroughly, to be quite frank with you. But it is an influential work with a lot of philosophical discussion in story form. Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, The Red Badge of Courage. William James was an American philosopher, psychologist, who came up with an original American philosophy of pragmatism, and he wrote a book on the varieties of religious experience. Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, worth a read. Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote a lot, but he was influential in ways we may not understand in pop culture. He's someone who's referenced a lot, but he's very largely misunderstood. If I could recommend to you to read one thing by Nietzsche, I would recommend Beyond Good and Evil. So Nietzsche, of course, was an atheist. He's famous for that. But he is different from many modern atheists in that he stares... modern atheism is more polite. It's sort of sugar-coated. Nietzsche stares atheism in the face, and I think embraces it for what it is. I think he sees it fairly clearly. Maybe not even to its full extent, but he sees it and he embraces it. And in my mind, he's admirable for that. But Nietzsche was influential in this regard. He knew that the Western system of morality in the United States and in Europe had developed under classical and Christian influences. In his time, he saw that, in his mind, Western civilization was sick. It was ill. It had ceased to produce great men. And he blames, of course, herd morality for this, which he associates with Christianity and Judaism. Socialism, Judaism, Christianity, democracy are manifestations of herd morality. These are weak men who sort of group together out of, there's no good English translation, but resentment towards those who are strong or in power. They group together and impose their morality, essentially. So Nietzsche knew, and many modern atheists would not like to admit this, but Nietzsche knew that the Western system of morality had developed with strong Christian influences. It was tied to the Christian view of God. This had affected law, art, everything. So he knew that though he thought God did not exist, and that this system of morality was largely arbitrary, he knew that removing God from the picture surgically would affect the whole body. It would affect the system of morality and all the things tied to it. This is why I think Nietzsche is admirable, because he saw this when others did not. So in his novel, he has a madman who comes to a group of people, and I can imagine these probably well-to-do people standing around in perhaps nice clothes, having polite social conversation, and in comes a crazy man, I can imagine, with wild eyes. And he looks around with crazed eyes, and he says, "I've come too soon. You don't understand yet the consequences of what we've done. We have loosed the moon from the orbit of the sun. There's no telling where we're going. You guys can't see yet what you've done. God is dead and we've killed him." So, of course, Nietzsche did not think God actually existed, so of course we didn't kill him in a literal, physical sense. What he meant was the impact of the death of God on culture, philosophy, morality was going to be massive. And people in his day did not see it yet. Nietzsche did see it. at least to a far more clear extent than others around him. And so Nietzsche, who is often considered to be in pop culture a nihilist, was not a nihilist, but Nietzsche knew that a period of nihilism was coming. He knew that the West was going to go through convulsions, moral convulsions, confusion, a period of nihilism, and perhaps violence because of what we've done, the consequences of the philosophical decisions that we've made. When people thought they could keep the Christian morality without God, and Nietzsche said no. He did not applaud this. He did not applaud nihilism. He wanted to create a new morality, but he knew that nihilism was coming. However, Nietzsche was also not an innocent bystander. If you read his book, Beyond Good and Evil, he rails against Christianity. I think his railings are hollow, largely. But he rails against it. He certainly wanted to do away with Christian morality because he thought it was an evil thing. Evil. But he wanted to put in its place something where the strong could rule. Democracy was not something he favored. It was evil for weak men to rule the strong. But Nietzsche is someone who is very influential in later thinkers. There's many connections that should be made. Without Nietzsche, there would be no Sartre. And that's probably a discussion for another video. Max Weber, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, a book which claimed that capitalism was successful because of the work ethic of Protestants, meaning that Protestants saw glory in any task. If you're sweeping the floor, if that was God's will, then do it for the glory of God, so do it well, you work hard. That had some influence on the success of capitalism and industrialization in his mind. Sigmund Freud, The Origin and Development of Psychoanalysis, Civilization and Its Discontents. T.S. Eliot. So T.S. Eliot was one of the first early modern poets. So after the ancient world, medieval world, Renaissance, Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romantics, now you have sort of this modern period in art. T.S. Eliot is someone that I don't fully understand, but he was a modern poet who, in my mind, what he did was he saw the effects of Nietzsche's death of God on the arts, in that side of culture. And so when he wrote a poem like The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, that poem was considered shocking because it was vulgar. It broke structure. It talked about sort of vulgar, crude things. I don't know that Eliot liked that, but he knew that the death of God destroyed structure. It had effects on culture. I'm not making this up. He wrote a book on Christianity and culture. T.S. Eliot, an American, moved to England and joined the Anglican Church. Though he was a modernist poet, I think he was conflicted about modernism. It seems to me that at some point in his life he did not like modernism. He thought we'd made a mistake. By the way, his Wasteland is read by the man who played Obi-Wan Kenobi on YouTube. It's fantastic. Definitely check that out. We've talked about Einstein. Rauschenbach was a liberal Christian who wrote about liberal Christian theology. If Jesus did not rise from the dead literally, if miracles don't happen, if God is not the way we thought he was, what relevance does Christianity have? Well, he wrote a book on a theology for the social gospel. And back in the early 1900s, this is what fundamentalists were largely reacting against, liberal Christians saw relevance in some of the aspects of Christian morality in a time of great moral and social change. And so they took those aspects of social morality, of charity, and they used that to drive social change, whether it be for their view of equality or social justice. For good or for bad, that is the focus of much of liberal Christianity in the 1900s. G.K. Chesterton, a Roman Catholic thinker from the early 1900s, he's a character man. He's entertaining. Read Orthodoxy and read The Everlasting Man. Now, those are books that'll blow your hair back. Virginia Woolf, a modernist writer and thinker. A Room of One's Own is worth reading, for sure. That is sort of an early pre-feminist work, perhaps first-wave feminism type. Know something about Virginia Woolf. We'll skip over much here. I would recommend to you read C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. The Abolition of a Man is a book that I think every man should read. I try to read it at least once a year. But this is a time when Lewis, it's a rather dense book. You may have to read it a few times to understand it. Lewis is writing against a view of morality that had worked its way into education, in which it was thought that morality or even beauty were not really real concrete things. Beauty was extremely subjective. And so when you see a waterfall, you don't see a sublime thing. You have feelings that are sublime. Lewis rejected this fully, and he talks about Roman patriotism, about ideas about what it means to be a man, about having a moral sense, an organ, a chest, about being a man, and having conviction about morality rather than just thinking this is just simply my opinion. My country is worth dying for is not something you can sort of be in the middle about on the battlefield. You have to have a moral organ that gives you conviction to stand your ground on the battlefield rather than run away and think about logical arguments. Lewis is convinced that we were attenuating that moral organ that gives us conviction, backbone, our chest, and that we now make men without chests and demand of them courage, and we're fools for doing so. C.S. Lewis is The Abolition of Man. He also, it's sort of predictive. I think he called some things. It's a book that's difficult, it's easy to misunderstand, but take the time, especially if you're a man, or if you have your parents and you have male children of understanding. Jean-Paul Sartre, French existentialist thinker. In 1943, he wrote On Being and Nothingness, a dense and tough work, a lengthy work. But know something about Sartre. So Sartre, following Nietzsche, an existentialist, now thought that morality aside, let's say it this way, human nature, Sartre thought that contra Aristotle, who thought that we are human beings and that as an individual, I am born into the human family and I have a universal human nature. I have my own nature, but Western civilization, since Aristotle, thought that I belong to a category of beings named humans and that all human beings share human nature. And what was said was that essence precedes existence, meaning that the nature of what it means to be human precedes the existence of individual humans. So human nature is set long before I showed up on the scene. I'm born into it. I'm born being a human being with a set nature. Sartre reversed it. He said that existence precedes essence. The implications meaning in a crude way that there is no set human nature, this category of things in which you're born into. You exist, and then you choose your own essence. Sartre thought that we are damned to be free. We must choose our own nature, our own will, our own path. This might sound romantic until you realize the extent to which he meant this. This would have effect, if you can make the connections for yourself, on later thinkers about morality, of gender theory, etc. So Sartre's an important person. To be frank, at a time of doubt, I considered Sartre and almost went that route myself. But I think natural law speaks to that pretty well. Schrodinger, What is Life? George Orwell, certainly know something about George Orwell. If you only have time to read one thing by Orwell, read Animal Farm. He says some very powerful things in a concise and very entertaining, interesting way. So read Animal Farm. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is very important to the United Nations. But read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for yourself. Mrs. Roosevelt had something to do with this. But it's interesting. The Declaration of Independence from the United States seeks to justify the rights contained in the Constitution, the ideas behind our existence. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't really seek to justify that. It assumes that these rights are there. That is a shift, I think, that is worth taking note of and thinking something about. Heisenberg's Physics and Philosophy, don't fully understand that one myself. Levi Strauss, his Structural Anthropology and early anthropology work. John Rawls' A Theory of Social Justice, a Theory of Justice. This is important political theory, 1970s. Many Democrats, this sort of informs the Democratic perspective, the Democratic Party's perspective of rights. It is different in that Rawls discusses a veil of ignorance. How do we justify rights if natural law is bunk or not what we thought it was? John Rawls offers a model for justice and for rights, in which you'd have to read it for yourself, but it does definitely lead to a different understanding of equality, for example. But he's worth knowing something about. Dawkins' The Selfless Gene, that's an important book. Whether you're a Christian or an atheist, this is a book on sort of evolutionary biology. By the way, you can get this on Audible. Again, I get no kickback from Audible, but Dawkins himself, I think, reads this book and a couple of his others. It's pretty neat. If you have a busy commute, that's a good one to listen to. Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of a Man. Stephen Hawking, he wrote a couple. He's very popular. He's been on The Simpsons. He's a pop culture scientist. He was a brilliant man, but he definitely shifted his view, his models, over time, understandably. But understand, if you read his earlier works, he might disagree with those works later in his work. His final book is sort of an atheist polemic, but his earlier books, The Brief History of Time and Universe in a Nutshell, are something that are good for a casual read. And so we've traveled through Western Civ, so very quickly here are some topical discussions. If you would like to know something about postmodernism, that is a term that we use very loosely. It can mean different things. It's rather vague, understandably so. It is a difficult concept. To understand postmodernism, I suggest you know something about Nietzsche, Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir, a companion of Sartre, who was a very influential feminist thinker from, I would say, perhaps maybe second-wave feminism. But to know something about postmodernism, you must know something about, I think, those thinkers. Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality. If sexual morality is arbitrary, that means those who have not conformed to sexual morality might be oppressed minorities. There are people who have not conformed to what society considered to be moral and upright. So what do we do with them? Well, he writes a book on the history of sexuality. It's a postmodern view. A man named Derrida wrote a book called Grammatology. Don't be hard on yourself if you don't read that book. It is tough. But the idea of deconstructionism, which is very popular now, even in movies, to take a norm, a trope that is privileged, and deconstruct it, to turn it on its head. So discussions on privilege, on deconstructionism, a lot of that comes from Derrida. So I would suggest looking him up on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. A book that explains postmodernism is Pauline Marie Rosenau, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the name, wrote a book called Postmodernism and the Social Sciences, Insights, Inroads, and Intrusions. Postmodernism is a very big factor in the social sciences right now in academia. It is sort of in vogue. That's a book that discusses that, and it's very important. I think that was a book recommended by Harvard. By the way, just a thought, you can get on Ivy League universities' websites, see what their students are reading in certain classes that you're interested in, get those books from the bookstore on the internet, or you could get the book list from that and then order them cheaply elsewhere and consider them for yourself. You want to get a degree, but you will know something about what they're reading. Glenn Denning wrote a book called Derrida, a very short introduction trying to explain Derrida and postmodernism. A book that is very critical of postmodern thinkers is a book by British conservative philosopher Roger Scruton called Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, and he takes them to task. It actually to harm of his own career, because ideas and thinkers that were popular he considers to be fools and frauds, but an entertaining book nonetheless. If you're interested in Christian apologetics, if you're a Christian who'd like to know something about defending your faith, or if you're a non-Christian who wants to know something more about why Christians believe what we believe, I would like to suggest these books. These books may not be entirely convincing to you, but I think they will give you food for thought. At an entry level or layman's level, Craig Blomberg, he's an evangelical scholar, writes a book called Can We Still Believe the Bible? It's a fairly easy to read book in which he counters some pop culture claims against, say, the historical reliability of the New Testament. It's a good book to start out with. Lee Strobel is now a very popular book, wrote a book called The Case for Christ. Lee Strobel was a journalist who was an atheist who went around interviewing actual scholars and philosophers whose opinions are worth considering. This is a layman's level book, so it's great introductory. It's a great introductory conversation. And if you'd like to go deeper, you can get the bibliography and get the books by those scholars and get a little bit more in-depth conversation. But if you don't want to go too in-depth, that's a great book to start out with. Gary Habermas and Michael Licona wrote a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, a good layman's book discussing historical evidence for why Christians believe Jesus rose from the dead and why it makes sense. Ed Feser wrote that book called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide. The reason I put that on the Christian apologetics list is because it discusses Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God, some of which I found helpful, and Feser's discussion of it is highly worth some time. It's an easy read, maybe take a week or two and read through it. Christian or not, that's worth considering. Alistair McGrath wrote a book called Intellectuals Don't Need God and Other Modern Myths. And McGrath takes common objections to the Christian faith, and he takes common reasons to believe in Christianity, and he puts them in dialogue, and it's in a rather simple way, and you can get a very concise discussion of very important arguments for and against Christianity. So that's a very helpful book I found. John Lennox, a mathematician out of Oxford University, wrote a book called 7 Days That Divide the World, the beginning according to Genesis and science. And that discussion by John Lennox, whether you agree or not, is a discussion about really the interpretation of the book of Genesis. Does the book of Genesis stand in conflict necessarily to scientific views of the age of the earth, for example? So when I was a teenager and I was going to church faithfully, just about the only Christian apologetics I was exposed to were arguments about the age of the earth. Christians, very sincere Christians, did not want to compromise a legitimate interpretation of Scripture, which they held to be inerrant. And so scientific models which suggest that the earth is much older than 6,000 or 10,000 years were held in suspect, or actually as direct challengers to the Christian worldview. And all Christian apologetic energies that I found, almost all of it, was directed towards the age of the earth, or evolution. John Lennox gives a good discussion there. What a Christian would not want to do, I would suggest, is compromise the Scriptures. But is that where the focus of Christian apologetics should be? I would say, to respect to many of my friends, certainly not. And John Lennox gives a very good, very easy, very quick read discussion of that. C.S. Lewis wrote Mere Christianity. This is from his radio lectures back in the, I want to say, 40s. These are short discussions of many issues, say from the existence of God to Christian morality to miracles. And these are things that are maybe a bit difficult to understand, but worth a very careful read. Nancy Pearcey wrote a book called Saving Leonardo. Now, with respect to Miss Pearcey, I don't think perhaps she sees enough nuance in the development of the Western culture, but she gives a very good conservative overview. It's fairly concise. It's sort of like a conservative Christian commentary on the history of Western culture and the arts. And that's something I would suggest you take some time, if you're a Christian, especially a conservative Christian, and want to see the difference of traditional ideas of art and Christian views of beauty and art, and how it's changed and been challenged in, say, modern film. That's a great book to have. Dr. Holly Ordway is someone I've come to respect. I will say that I don't agree with Dr. Ordway on perhaps certain doctrinal things. This is a woman who's come from a hard atheism to Christian faith. And now, whether I agree with her or not on certain doctrinal issues, she is someone I think is extremely sincere and very intelligent. She's thought through really the history of world thought. She sort of pieced it together and has a very synoptic view of how things have worked. In that, she has a different approach to Christian apologetics. What helped me were logical syllogisms, arguments, and historical evidence. Those things are necessary for many of us. But Dr. Ordway suggests that using the imagination and the arts is another way of presenting Christian ideas to the world. Well, why is that? In short, because whether we like it or not, most of us absorb our beliefs through the culture around us. We're affected by the movies we see. There are ideas, worldviews, theming in movies, discussions of morality, of all kinds of things in film, paintings, music, etc. Books. That's not conjecture, that's really simply how it is. It has been for a long time. So Dr. Ordway gives a book called Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach to defending the faith, in which she suggests we can use the arts to help people re-understand or regain an understanding of Christian ideas and themes that perhaps they've lost contact with. When Christians say God or redemption or beauty or salvation or resurrection or sin, what do we mean by these things? I find increasingly that many people have a shallow or poor understanding, perhaps through no fault of their own, of things that Christians try to talk to them about. And you have to back up and sort of walk them along. And so Dr. Ordway suggests we can actually use the arts as a way to reintroduce the ideas into sort of the cultural fabric. It's a book worth considering, I think. As a side note, William Lane Craig is a Christian philosopher. Perhaps I wouldn't agree with him on everything, but he is certainly a man worth hearing out. For Christian apologetics, he has several arguments he promotes for the existence of God that are worth considering. But he also has a YouTube series called The Defender's Class. If you're interested in apologetics or simply historical Christian theology, he goes through different views from different denominations on, say, the doctrine of justification or last things or of Genesis, and he gives their scriptural view of this, and he tries to argue from Scripture for their view, and then he'll talk about in the end his own view. And that is a good introduction to Christian theology. I've listened to many of his lectures, and it's a good refresher, if anything, if you want to go a little bit deeper about Christian theology from Scripture, from history. If you want to go deeper about Christian apologetics, here's some slightly more scholarly works, so more intense works. But if you're serious, these are serious books worth some serious time. Craig Blomberg wrote a book called The Historical Reliabilities of the Gospels. Worth considering. In pop culture, there are many arguments against whether or not the Gospels are even worth anything historically. Whether or not you hold the miracles or the resurrection of Christ, for example. So he gives a very good scholarly discussion of this. William Lane Craig wrote Reasonable Faith. N.T. Wright, an Anglican man, wrote a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's a thick book. It's tough. It's exhaustive and exhausting, I like to say. But this book helped me when I personally doubted whether or not I could believe that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. Is this an outlandish claim, and why could you believe this outside of the Bible to begin with? If I am skeptical of the Bible, what grounds do I have for believing that Christ rose from the dead? This is a great discussion of that, N.T. Wright's book. It will take you some time to think through, but I will suggest to you, if you're serious about that topic, that is a book that is seriously worth your time. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Miracles, worth considering. Bruce Metzger was a very respected scholar. He's passed away now. He was actually mentor to the skeptical scholar Bart Ehrman, who is probably, if you want to read a very skeptical, not atheist, but almost atheist point of view on the scriptures, Bart Ehrman's great to read on that. Bruce Metzger is a man who was his mentor, a very respected scholar. He wrote a book called The New Testament, its background, growth, and contents. And that is a book that I think is worth considering for any Christian to have a mature view of, whether you agree with them or not, a mature understanding of how we got the Bible, the canon of Scripture, the manuscript data behind the Bible, etc. If you'd like to know something about atheism, whether you're an atheist who wants some good books to read on atheism, or if you're a Christian trying to understand why people are atheists to begin with, I would recommend that you read the Gospels, know something about Aquinas' arguments for God, know what you're rejecting. I think that's fair. And Nietzsche, I think if you want to understand atheism, you really need to understand Nietzsche. Here's some additional books. Bertrand Russell, a very popular atheist from the 1940s, wrote a book called Why I'm Not a Christian. It is perhaps not utterly convincing, but it is a book discussing about why an intelligent person was not a Christian. Michael Martin, The Case Against Christianity. This is a polemic against the Christian faith, against the existence of God, about evil, about does evil, the reality of evil and suffering in our lives, does that negate the existence of a good and loving God as Christians see him? That's a good discussion of that. Also of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Did he rise from the dead or no? Is there reason to believe this? This book I read years ago, and it gave me pause as a Christian. And I will say it's to me now it's not convincing at all, but it is worth considering if you want to know something about why atheists don't believe. Stephen Hawking, The Grand Design. Stephen Hawking wanted a grand theory of everything, right? His dream before he died, I think, was to have that unified field theory, this grand theory of everything. In that book, he is far more intelligent than I, but I was disappointed in the book because I think it was a premature polemic against all of Western philosophy. He says within the first page or two that philosophy is dead. Scientists are those who now have the answers. But throughout the book, he does philosophy, and he offers, in sort of competition to theism, he offers his view of the explanation of everything. It's worth a read. You could probably read it in a few nights. Richard Dawkins' very popular book, The God Delusion. Christopher Hitchens, a very witty fellow. I kind of miss the guy. God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. That's a man I have some respect for. I think he was tragically and utterly wrong. But he had, I think in many ways his intentions were correct. And his book's worth considering because a lot of young men, especially, who have left the Christian faith, follow Hitchens and Dawkins, right or wrong. Sam Harris is another one of the new atheists. He wrote a book called Free Will. He wrote another book called The Moral Landscape. These books are, philosophically, I think, they have issues, but this is where a lot of young men stand, so they're good to understand. Lawrence Krauss, a physicist, wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing, and in this book, he writes an explanation for how you can have a universe from nothing without God. I think a key issue in the academic sciences, or the academic fields, is that we have diversified so much that whereas perhaps in the 1800s or 1700s an educated man would know the gist of all the fields, we've advanced so much in so many ways that people specialize in a field. And I think an issue might be that people have difficulty discussing cross fields now. I think we argue around each other a bit. You almost need an interpreter, I think. So Lawrence Krauss, an intelligent man, a physicist, is in dialogue with philosophy about ontological philosophy, being, matter, and there is a disconnect there, and I think that might be something that needed to be addressed. But this is a book that many people stand with, so it's worth reading. Carl Sagan, always a great read. A Demon-Haunted World, Science is a Candle in the Dark. Here are some books that are from world thought that are worth considering, that were influential. Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching. This is a book about, of course, the Tao, the Tao. And this is, C.S. Lewis actually makes mentions of this, and that he thinks that the Tao, or the Tao, is an Eastern concept similar to the Western concept of natural law. The way things are. The way. Regardless, this is a man worth considering. He was no fool. And it is interesting that though Eastern and Western philosophy disagree on so much, there is also common ground there. We are discussing the same reality after all. The Analects of Confucius. There are some Hindu works worth knowing something about as well. These are all on the list, of course. As far as modern politics and political theory, on Facebook we have many debates about politics, right? You can log on to Twitter or Facebook and get all the political discussion you'd like. What I would suggest is that these books might help us form more full opinions than sort of the memes we pass around on the internet. Henry Kissinger wrote a book about diplomacy. Samantha Power, a former advisor to former President Barack Obama, wrote a book called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And these are books that are competing views of America's role in the world. What stance should America have as a nation, as an entity, towards foreign powers, towards those who cannot help themselves, towards genocide taking place that we know about, that we could stop? There are competing views there, of course. These are some books worth considering about that. And Samantha Power did some work in the United Nations. A very intelligent woman. Though she advised President Barack Obama, they definitely disagreed. In fact, The Atlantic put out an article on President Barack Obama's foreign policy and his legacy there, and how she would also often urge for action in foreign affairs. And President Barack Obama's stance was to not act, right? Not to get political, but they had some conflict there, but she also advised him. It was very interesting. And I guess even in meetings publicly, they had some disagreement. Barack Obama's The Audacity of Hope. Hillary Clinton, It Takes a Village. Fareed Zakaria's The Future of Freedom. He also wrote The Post-American World. He's a journalist, but he's got his particular view of, now that the rest of the world has industrialized, much of the rest of the world has industrialized and is sort of caught up to the United States in many ways, how can the United States stay relevant? Whether you agree or not, this is a view that many on the left subscribe to. Noam Chomsky. I will say this. So in the movie Good Will Hunting, good old Good Will Hunting recommends Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. Howard Zinn was a Marxist. He's a straight-up communist. He has a book called The People's History of the United States. Good old Will Hunting also suggests Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, in which, sure, authority of the government comes from the consent of the governed, but we manufacture that consent. We found a way to force, to trick consent. Here's what I would say about people like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn. The value in Zinn's People's History of the United States is that he has discussed some of the darker aspects of America's history that more American-friendly or conservative historians would sort of gloss over and sometimes perhaps to an uncomfortable level sugarcoat. Noam Chomsky is very upfront with American businesses' corruption and foreign affairs. But what Zinn and Chomsky have done is they've extrapolated from mistakes from darkness that the United States is an overwhelmingly evil entity. Zinn's view of America is a very dark one. Personally, I would disagree with him there. So there is value in what he has to say, but keep in mind that his overall model for understanding the country, the West in general and the United States, is that of an imperialist power who has used its power overwhelmingly for bad. In other words, the United States, the world is probably a better place, would be a better place without the United States. I would certainly disagree with him there, but that is where a lot of people they would line up with that view. Daniel Oppenheimer wrote a book called Exit Right, in which many leftist thinkers have, as they've gotten older, become more conservative. Ronald Reagan's in there, Christopher Hitchens in there. It's a book worth considering. Dick Cheney wrote a book called Exceptional, in which former Vice President Cheney offers his view as why the United States is necessary in foreign affairs. Peter Hitchens, brother of Chris Hitchens, wrote a book called The Abolition of Britain, in which he thinks that traditional British culture and the things that he sees as his heritage that are valuable are being abolished, and that's a sad thing to him. And he offers his understanding of why that is. Roger Scruton is a man worth listening to, I think. He's a conservative British philosopher. If you'd like to understand the role of conservatism, I've noticed that many younger conservatives aren't as concerned about the economic side of the Republican Party. They're more concerned about cultural heritage, and I think they're looking for a sort of a voice to voice what they think about this. Roger Scruton wouldn't line up with American conservatives on everything, but I would recommend that you read or consider either The Meaning of Conservatism by Scruton or How to Be a Conservative by Scruton, in which he discusses why he sees value in British culture, common law, the institutions handed down to this generation. He lines up with Edmund Burke on some things. Michael Sandel is an American academic. He wrote Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. Robert George is an American academic, I believe out of Harvard, but he's conservative. He wrote a book called In Defense of Natural Law. George Bush and Brent Scowcroft, A World Transformed, again about foreign policy. And for giggles, Ronald Reagan's American Life. Geopolitics, very quickly, George Friedman is a geopolitical analyst. People have hired him to give them advice. He wrote a book called The Next Decade and the Next 100 Years, in which he sees, he's trying to look at geopolitical events forming up and seeing what he thinks might happen, things that we might assume that are going to continue as they are, he suggests might not. So those are worth considering. A journalist, Thomas Friedman, wrote a book called The World is Flat, in which Friedman discusses that, in his view, common boundaries, whether they be geographical boundaries, mountains, rivers, etc., may not have the effect that they did on global affairs, on the economy, because now the world's flat. We have technology, the digital age. That's not a very accurate summary of his book, but it is worth considering. George Friedman wrote a couple of them. They're all on the list here. So another very important topic, wherever you stand on it, it is a very relevant topic. Islam in the West. So there are different views, of course, about what the West should do about Islam. You could probably categorize those into three models, and perhaps I'll make a video about this at some point. But here are some books that I think are worth considering from various points of view. Certainly read the Quran if you're interested in Islam. At least know something about the Quran. I have a copy. I've read it, I think, 3 times. I don't understand it all, but it is something worth knowing something about in the current cultural climate. Karen Armstrong is very Islamic friendly. She's friendly to the ideology of Islam, and she wrote a book called Islam. Tariq Ramadan is a man who is, I think, trying to reform Islam to be something that fits in well to the West. But he's also trying to, I think, bolster the image of Muslims and the ideology of Islam in Western universities. He wrote a book called Islam, the West, and the Challenges of Modernity. He wrote several others, but that's one worth listening to. Sam Harris, an American sort of Enlightenment rationalist atheist, had a dialogue, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his name, please, with Maajid Nawaz, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, a dialogue. Maajid was a extremist who would certainly not be anyone I would agree with on many things. But he is now someone who is a sort of westernized person who is arguing for the value of Islam in the West. Sam Harris is, of course, rather skeptical of this, and they have a good dialogue. I think in the end, when you really analyze both of their ideas, not a lot of progress was made, but it is a dialogue that needs to take place, and it's a short book, and I would suggest taking the time to read through that one. Nabil Qureshi, Answering Jihad, A Better Way Forward. This man was a former Muslim who converted to Christianity, who offers his thoughts on a better way forward with these things, worth considering. The Crusades Through Arab Eyes and The Arab Mind are books that General Mattis suggests to read. These are, The Arab Mind is a book from, I think, the 70s, but it discusses Arabic culture and sort of their mindset, their makeup of why the cultural heritage they've been handed and why they think the way they think. The Crusades Through Arab Eyes is a compilation of Islamic historical figures and their view of the Western Crusades. It is definitely worth considering, I think. It's actually interesting to read the Western point of view and then the Arab point of view. As far as economics are concerned, there are many models out there, but if you want to understand the models better, whether you understand the sort of leftist, democratic type model of economics, or sort of the traditional free market model, or where the Republicans are coming from, here are some books I suggest. John Maynard Keynes, A General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. This is a book that FDR would have liked. This is a book that has influenced a lot of Democratic thinkers. I think even Presidents Barack Obama and Clinton. So definitely know something about that one. He was not an economist, but he had a theory about how the economy could work. Now, this is not a Marxist book. This is where the Democrats often get some of their ideas. On the other side of the aisle, you've got Thomas Sowell, a very intelligent man, wrote a book called Basic Economics. Though I personally would not agree with the extent to which he thinks the free market will solve things, he does a very good job of explaining how the free market has made us economically successful, and explaining just in sort of basic ABC form, basic economics. Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Friedman, F.A. Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. And then where Mrs. Clinton, I think, comes from is sort of where Joseph Stiglitz is at. He's a very intelligent man. And he's sort of not a socialist, not an utter free market thinker, like perhaps Hayek, but he's sort of for a reformed capitalism. He wrote a book called The Roaring '90s and the Age of Turbulence. Definitely check out, that's the Roaring '90s. Check out Joseph Stiglitz. He also has a book called Making Globalization Work, which is very relevant. Alan Greenspan wrote a book. Alexander Hamilton, believe it or not, wrote a book called, he wrote a report on the subject of manufacturers. Check that out. It's got something to say about tariffs. Feminism. If you're interested in feminism, it should be said, I think, that feminism is a term we use loosely. So feminism can refer to different waves of feminism. I've used the term referring perhaps to first or second wave feminism. Personally, I break with third wave feminism on quite a bit, for what it's worth. So sometimes when I say feminism, I might be referring to an earlier form. But these are some books that are certainly worth considering to understand feminism as a whole. Know something about Virginia Woolf, Mary Wollstonecraft. Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. It is not where I am at, but it is a very influential book, The Second Sex. She, of course, does not see, if human nature is not set, then human gender is not set. And so de Beauvoir does not see differences between the genders as being very concrete. There's very little difference between us in her mind. Betty Friedman, The Feminine Mystique, is a very influential book, more modern feminism. Gloria Steinem, still a voice in the feminist movement, moving beyond words. Margaret Mead, this is very important, not just in feminism, but in sociology, Male and Female, Coming of Age in Samoa, in which she discusses gender constructs in other cultures. She has quite a bit to say. Bell hooks, this is more on, for lack of a better word, the fringe, but with sort of modern third wave feminism, outlaw culture, resisting representations. If you want to understand where perhaps a lot of young women who are on that side of the fence are coming from, these are books you just might want to give a look up on Wikipedia. Alan Johnson, The Gender Knot, Unraveling Our Patriarchal Legacy. Now, those who are feminists who dissent with modern third wave feminism, Christina Hoff Sommers, The War Against Boys, and she sees that the postmodern deconstruction of gender norms has not always been a good thing in her mind. She's a feminist, but she dissents from sort of modern third wave feminism. Camille Paglia, Sex, Art, and American Culture. She dissents from some of modern feminism as well. And contra-feminism against sort of a lot of feminism altogether would be Phyllis Schlafly, The Flip Side of Feminism, in which she believed that women should find value and meaning in traditional gender roles and norms. Probably not a very popular idea, but it was influential there for some time. Now about gender theory. This movement, with the modern idea of gender theory, of homosexual marriage, etc., depends upon the postmodern movement in many ways. But a key thinker there is Judith Butler. She wrote a book called Gender Trouble, in which, again, if human nature, I think without Nietzsche, Sartre, and Foucault, there would be no Butler. But Judith Butler argues that if there is no human essence that precedes the existence of individual humans, then there is no concrete, real human gender. So gender is arbitrary. So Sartre would say that gender is something that I don't think he said gender, but human nature is something you choose. So work that out to gender. So gender, according to Judith Butler, is performative. It's something that is something we perform rather than something that is innate to us. It's a rather crude summary, but she is an influential thinker. If you don't read her book, so a lot of the transgender movement, homosexual movement, gay rights activists would get some of their ideas indirectly through Judith Butler. And you can listen to her on YouTube as well. Now, a man named Matthew Vines wrote a book called God and the Gay Christian, in which he is trying to reconcile gay marriage with Christian scripture. So he is attempting to reconcile the idea not just that homosexuals should be accepted as people, but that the lifestyle is a good lifestyle and should be accepted. And this is a lifestyle that is is even perhaps a morally good thing found in Scripture. And he attempts to reconcile those two things, God and the gay Christian. So this is a very difficult topic. But here are some books that I found very helpful on the abortion debate. I would like to say this very sincerely. I know that this is an issue that we can almost not help but be passionate about. Because at the end of the day, I recognize that someone is wrong on this issue. Bad wrong. Whether you're a woman who believes in how they see it, bodily autonomy, and if you believe you have innate rights that are being infringed upon by people on the right, I understand why someone would be upset about that. On the other hand, someone who has considered the abortion issue and has taken a pro-life position, then from their perspective, human beings, humans who are morally valuable, are under threat and even being destroyed. And that is something that you could hardly blame them for being very passionate about. If they believe that, then they would almost be wrong to not have some moral feelings about this. So I'd like to say this very carefully. This is an issue I'm still working through, but here are the two best books I've found on the issue. From the pro-choice side, I have found a book by Kate Greasley, I believe she's out of Oxford University, Arguments About Abortion, Personhood, Morality, and Law. She has a lecture I found on YouTube that's worth listening to. It's sort of a summary. And I'm still reading and rereading her work to make sure I understand her thoroughly, but it is by far the best pro-choice argument I've seen. One thing I've noticed on this issue, and I know this is a controversial issue, and people are very opinionated about it, and I would like to not get heated on the internet about it, but I have noticed that sometimes people on, at least at a pop culture level, sometimes speak around each other. So I've noticed people on the pro-choice side often argue from the position almost solely from bodily autonomy and the rights of the woman, her right to choose. And the idea of the fetus being a human person of moral worth is not the focus of their argument at all. And it's not even, to some of them, as relevant. Of course, those on the right would see that as the only issue. If this is a human being with moral worth and the right to life, then bodily autonomy doesn't override that. So I think sometimes the arguments, is what I'm suggesting, speak around each other, and we don't even, I've seen so many of us, we don't even meet in the middle and have the same conversation. We're having different conversations. Dr. Kate Greasley offers an argument that essentially she discusses various points of view, and she agrees that if the fetus, the embryo, is a moral person, is a person with moral worth, then that is the key issue, that is the Trump issue. But she suggests, the way I understand her argument is that embryologists would agree, and she would agree, that within days after conception, days, not weeks, the embryo, the fetus, is a human being. What else would it be? It is a living human being, but that it does not yet possess personhood. It's not a human person. And she discusses the idea that human personhood is something gradually achieved or gained by a developing fetus. If I understand her correctly, though, she places the threshold of moral worth, of rights, at birth. This is sort of the catalyst by which the developing child earns full membership in the human family. And that's where the law should reflect that. It's a very well written and considered and argued book. It seems to me problematic, personally. It is far better than Peter Singer's work. Peter Singer is the head of bioethics at Princeton, and he actually thinks that children could be terminated by parents several weeks after birth. To me, that's morally repugnant and evil. I'll call that, frankly. On the other side, so this is the best book I've found from the pro-choice side. You can find books by men like Dr. Willie Parker, an abortion doctor, a practicing doctor out of Mississippi, but I found it not a very well reasoned, but more of he's preaching to the choir, so it's a different kind of a book. On the pro-life side, you have Dr. Robert George out of Harvard, who's co-written the book, but it's called Embryo, A Defense of Human Life. And this book is, I think, by far the best pro-life book I found. And what Dr. George does is he goes through embryology textbooks, and he argues very compellingly that very early on, in the embryonic stage, that the embryo is a human being and also a human person. So by that, he means that the embryo is not a different type of being than a fully developed human adult. It's a human being at an early stage of development, just like a toddler, adolescent, teenager, young adult, etc. He argues very well for this, I think. And his concern is that if this is a human being, that if we as human beings are in a category of beings that have universally human or moral worth, and this is simply a human being at an early stage of development, regardless of whether or not the being has yet developed adequate reasoning skills or even a heartbeat. In George's argument, this is a being with full moral worth, who has the right to life. Perhaps it doesn't have the right to vote yet, but the fundamental rights that accompany all human beings are present with this early human being. And his concern, of course, is not just abortion. His concern is that at some point capitalism might take over and produce a group of people, a category of people, create them for research or for profit, and destroy them for such. And he sees this as being something that needs to be gotten a hold of in law, or it can be very concerning. Now, these are not layman's books. They're very difficult, both of them, but these are academically written books, and I think they're the best I've found. I don't think they're going to answer all the questions as far as law is concerned, as far as Roe v. Wade, as far as state laws are concerned, if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned. But these are books that I think deal with the more fundamental questions. These are the best I've found. I don't have all of the answers myself, but I think Dr. George offers a very compelling argument for personhood at a very early stage. Feel free to disagree with me of that, but those are books I've recommended. If you could recommend another book on the issue, I'd be very happy to read that as well. Supplemental literature and poetry here. I found several of them. I won't mention them all, but there are great works of poetry from history. John Donne, Alfred Lloyd Tennyson, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Oxford World Classics put out a book on the Anglo-Saxon world, an anthology in which it includes Beowulf and many of the medieval poems. It's great. Emily Dickinson, Ezra Pound, Philip Larkin, more modern stuff. Lots of good stuff there. And then I have a section on additional mathematics and science. I have actually not read quite all of these yet. I know they're very important, but these are books I don't fully understand myself or haven't read a couple of these yet. I will say Dr. Roger Penrose's book, The Road to Reality, is a very good guide. Actually, I've got it right here. This is a very good summary of the laws of physics and where we're at now, and he actually kind of guides you through it. And the math is a little bit tough, but he gives you some explanation, so this is a great sort of summary book, I think. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed this. I would like to suggest again, there are difficult topics here. These are difficult books about difficult things. But it would be easy for us to live sort of on the surface of the issues. It would be easy for us to be informed by comedians or by Facebook memes or by headlines about current issues. But I think it would be wise for us to step back and to see what older voices have said about all the issues we debate today, about art, about the nature of God, about salvation, about the state, about economics. You name it, the big issues we have, they've been discussed for a long time. So I would really like to suggest to you that this is an intimidating thing. These are, you see all the books behind me and the books I've recommended. This can be an intimidating thing, but think of it like a journey. This is something that it may take you a lifetime to do, but even if you never get through the journey all together, you'll be further along than you were. And that's where I'm at. I'm still trying to master these books myself. I've read Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil several times. I understand basically what he's saying, but I haven't fully mastered Nietzsche yet, if that makes sense. I'm still working through this. But I do know that my thinking on this is much further along than it would have been had I not understood any of these books at all. So I'd like to recommend to you, don't be discouraged. Start somewhere, and even if you never get through with them, just get a little bit further down the road than you are now, right? And again, I would like to recommend to you that you get a good Bible and read it as an adult. So I actually got a new Bible. This is printed by the world's oldest Bible publishers in Cambridge. This is the sort of the royal publishing house here. They've been printing Bibles for centuries. This is a beautiful leather bound with sort of a rose gilt. Whether you're a Christian or not, I would like to suggest to you to get a good Bible, sit down, make some time, and read it as an adult. It'll challenge you in your personal life, but even if you're not a Christian, just try to understand the influence that this book has had on Western civilization. The world we live in today didn't come out of a vacuum. It came to us slowly out of classical and Christian influences. Those are things I think that are very important to understand. But I thank you very much for making time. This has been a long video. It's not polished, but I thank you much for taking time out of your day to spend time with me in my home. So I appreciate that. Eventually, I would like to make a video perhaps discussing some of the issues here, trying to present fairly different sides of arguments, but then also perhaps offering my thoughts on some of these issues. I also could make a more detailed, fuller list on certain individual topics. But either way, I appreciate your time. Hope you have a great day. Take care.